Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Welcome back. We are ready to talk a little bit about how the urinary system is regulated. And we're going to see a common pattern here. So we saw this also with the digestive system, where we had both an auto-regulation, we had a centralized nervous system regulation, and we had an endocrine regulation. And, really we saw that. We've seen that in all body systems, if we stop and think about it. It's important to remember anytime we are regulating something, we have to have a way of detecting it. So let's actually start by talking about, we are going to see our baroreceptor cells are going to be important. Remember, a barometer is measuring pressure. So baroreceptor is talking about a receptor that detects pressure. And we do see that these are located in the aorta and the carotid sinuses. So we're talking here, of course, about blood pressure. And we already know the intimate connection between regulating blood pressure and the kidney. And what we'll see with the baroreceptors, as you increase your blood pressure, you'll see that results in an increase in the baroreceptor signal. And then we'll see ultimately that's going to cause vasodilation and increase glomerular filtration rate. So we're going to get more filtration happening at the glomerulus. And so this is going to reduce the overall blood volume, and that's going to reduce blood pressure. And so we see the opposite happening when our blood pressure is low. We get a decrease of the baroreceptor signaling. And this is going to trigger vasoconstriction, which would ultimately reduce the glomerular filtration rate. We'll also see that we have what are referred to as granular cells. And these are located in the afferent arteriole of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So we talked about several other types of cells involved in the juxtaglomerular apparatus. We mentioned, of course, the juxtaglomerular cell, and we mentioned the macula densa. So this is a third cell type in that particular region. And we'll see that this is the cell that will actually be releasing, renin in response to a low blood pressure. We're going to get the increase of renin. So we mentioned renin was being released by the macula densa. So these are going to be cells located in the macula densa. And then the third sort of regulation we'll see here with we're saying cardiomyocytes. So cardiomyo is talking about cardiac muscle, and site is cells, so cardiac muscle cells. And this is going to be in our atria. And what we see here is when these cells are increased in their stretch. So when these cells increase their stretch, that means there's more blood. There's a huge amount of blood in the atria, really stretching out the cells. So that means you have a high blood volume, a high blood pressure. And so that's going to be the signal to release, that's going to increase the release of ANH, which we've talked about before as atrial natriuretic peptide, or natriuretic hormone, rather. Okay, so that would tie in with some of the endocrine. So these are some of the cells that are responding to changes in the blood pressure. When we talk about the regulation of the entire urinary system, we will see that it is sympathetic division that's going to be involved here. And what we'll see is when you increase the stimulation of the sympathetic division, you're going to increase vasoconstriction. And so that's going to reduce the GFR. So when sympathetic division is active, you're constricting blood vessels to the kidney. Remember, you're redirecting blood flow to your extremities. And so you're reducing your amount of filtration that's happening here. And so we can say the opposite. When you're decreasing the sympathetic division stimulation, you're going to get vasodilation. And so now you're increasing your blood flow to the kidney. And so that's going to increase your glomerular filtration rate. When we look at autoregulation, what we're really talking about here is kind of two things. So we're going to be looking at the afferent and the efferent arterial diameters. And we're going to be looking at the glomerulus, I should say, diameter. So autoregulation is talking about altering the blood flow through the glomerulus. So remember, when we have a big afferent arteriole and a small efferent arteriole, we're increasing pressure, which increases filtration. So if we want to have a high GFR, then we're going to increase the afferent diameter and decrease the efferent diameter. If we need to do the reverse of that, so if we need to reduce our glomerular filtration rate, we're going to make the afferent diameter smaller. So we're going to reduce the blood that flows through there. We can also increase filtration by decreasing the glomerulus diameter. So that's going to, create more of a push for filtration. So here, when we talk about autoregulation, when we talk about the autoregulation, we can talk about having two mechanisms. So we can have what's called arterial myogenic mechanism. Or we can have what's called tubuloglomerular feedback. Okay, so let's look first at the arterial myogenic mechanism. So for the arterial myogenic mechanism, what we see is that if you stretch the muscle of your arteriole, you're going to end up getting contraction of those cells. So if you have a big flow of blood, you're stretching the muscle cell of the arteriole, and that's going to cause contraction, and that's going to reduce the blood flow. So this is very much regulating the flow of blood through the glomerulus. And then we'll see the opposite. So if you stop stretching the muscle cell, it's going to relax. So if there's no longer this big volume of blood and there's no longer this big push, then we're going to relax the vessel so that you're allowing more blood to flow through. So this is very much a on location, right? That's what we mean by autoregulation, and on location sort of control. Okay. We'll talk about the sometimes these words trick me up. I know y'all feel the same. Tubuloglomerular feedback. I did it. What we see here is that when we have a high GFR, so that's glomerular filtration rate, and we have a high osmolarity, of the tubular fluid. We get a greater flow in the distal convoluted tubule. So if you have a high glomerular filtration rate, so you filtered a lot of fluid into that capsular space, and that fluid has moved through the proximal convoluted tubule and it's moved through the loop of Henle and are in the DCT. What we see is that this will actually, when we have a great flow in the DCT, this will actually trigger the macula densa cells are going to release both, and we've mentioned these before, as local sort of local hormones or paracrine factors, ATP and adenosine. So if you have a big flow through the distal convoluted tubule, the macula densa cells will release ATP and adenosine. And this is going to stimulate the myogenic juxtaglomerular cells to actually constrict the afferent arteriole. So if we have a big flow of fluid in the DCT, we need to reduce the filtration. And we reduce the filtration by releasing ATP and adenosine from those macula densa cells. And that in turn is going to cause vasoconstriction, specifically of the afferent arteriole. So remember, if the afferent opening is large, you have a lot of blood flow. And if the afferent opening is small, you've reduced your blood flow. And so overall, this reduces blood flow. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong place on the screen. Reduces blood flow into the glomerulus. And so that's going to reduce the glomerular filtration rate, or the GFR. Okay. Up next, let's look at endocrine. Let's look at our endocrine. And we're going to see some old friends here for our endocrine. So that's where we're ready to go next. So let's actually start with our ANH. So I've written that up here. And ANH, remember, is standing for atrial natriuretic hormone. So let me just do like star beside endocrine, and then I'm going to star over here so we know we're talking about an endocrine hormone. And what we see with the atrial natriuretic peptide is that this is going to be released by those cardiomyocytes, right? And we're going to see that it's going to lead to an increase in the excretion of sodium ions. We'll see it's going to inhibit aldosterone release. We'll see that it is going to inhibit ADH release. And we'll see that it's going to dilate afferent arteriole and constrict efferent arteriole. And we'll also see that it is going to reduce our thirst. So overall, atrial natriuretic peptide is released when we have a high blood volume and high blood pressure, and we need to get rid of that liquid. And so what we do is we allow the sodium to be part of the urine. This is an important learning. Anywhere sodium is, water follows. So if you're allowing the sodium to be in the urine, this is going to help pull water into the urine instead of pull water out of the urine. And you're inhibiting two hormones that we're going to mention again, aldosterone and ADH. Okay. And we're dilating the afferent arterioles. So we're increasing our glomerular filtration and we're reducing our thirst. So we're not taking on any extra liquid. So overall, the effects of the arterial natriuretic peptide will be to increase glomerular filtration rate, and we're going to get a large dilute urine produced under the control here of the atrial natriuretic peptide. So we're trying to pull off some of that liquid that's in the body and get rid of that liquid. If we look at some of our other hormones here, so we'll do our endocrine in this pinky color to help us kind of pick that out. Maybe I'll do that. Let's also look next at what's called endothelium. We talked about endothelium when we were talking about blood clotting, and we said it was important in that vascular spasm. And so it should make sense that this is classified as a vasoconstrictor. So endothelium is an important vasoconstrictor. And we'll see this being released by those mesangial cells that are there in the part of the, what you call it? Bowman's capsule, Bowman's capsule. Okay. And then probably the other sequence to really look at here is renin. Now renin, we've talked about on repeat. We've talked about this on repeat. So this is being released by juxtaglomerular cells, and it's important in converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Remember that angiotensin 1 with the help of the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, gets converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is really going to be the hormone that's sort of responsible for all of the stuff that we're going to be looking at here. Angiotensin 2, we're going to see, is a vasoconstrictor of both the peripheral vessels, but also the afferent arteriole specifically. We'll see also that it's going to trigger the release of aldosterone. Now, aldosterone, we've talked about a few times. Aldosterone is going to be made by the adrenal cortex. And we're going to see overall, it's going to increase the sodium reabsorption. OpenStack's book really focuses on reabsorption at the collecting duct, but I've also read it at the DCT. So I'm going to list both DCT and collecting duct. We should also pay attention here that it can also promote potassium ion excretion. So what we can see happening is aldosterone can turn on this sodium potassium exchange pump. And when we're doing this exchange, the sodium is being retained by the body and the potassium is being excreted by the body. So in our next chapter, we're going to look at the balance of electrolytes, and we can see that if you have an issue with your aldosterone production, you might have an imbalance of your potassium, or some medications can also play around with that. I think it was interesting too that a hormone called progesterone, which we're going to talk about in the reproductive system, a hormone called progesterone can bind to aldosterone receptors, causing sodium retention. Wherever sodium goes, water follows. So if you're retaining sodium, you're going to be retaining some water as well. And sometimes then this is described as like bloating. And progesterone is a hormone that's released during menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. And so this can explain some of the bloating that can occur in both of those physiological processes. We'll also see aldosterone to trigger the release of ADH. So we've mentioned ADH also several times. So this should be an old friend. Remember, it stands for antidiuretic hormone. You can also call it vasopressin. Okay, and it's doing two things. So remember, we said it's going to increase the aquaporin channels in the cells of, and again, our book talks mostly about collecting duct, but I've also read it in the DCT, so I'm going to put both. Increase aquaporin channels of the DCT and collecting duct. And this is then increasing water reabsorption. We talked about this specifically. I'm going to erase that and say increase the facultative water reabsorption. So that's like that remaining flexible part where we can have like 10 to 15% of the water that's still in the tubular fluid at this point, or the urine, can be reabsorbed. And the other important job that we'll see of ADH is vasoconstriction. So that's how it gets that other name, vasopressin. We'll see too, angiotensin 2 is going to reduce thirst. Oh, excuse me, wrong direction. Increase thirst. So in the case of the renin release, you have low blood volume, low blood pressure. Maybe you're dehydrated a little bit, you haven't had enough fluids. And so what we're going to see overall is this is going to increase the GFR. I'm sorry, I'm working too fast here. We're decreasing the GFR. When we are constricting the afferent arteriole, we're reducing the blood flow into the glomerulus, so filtration rate would decrease. And we're also going to make a small amount of concentrated urine because we're reabsorbing water. We're reabsorbing that sodium ion. All right, y'all. We have 2 pieces left. We need to, we've been talking about this urine all this time, but we haven't actually defined, okay, what is the composition of urine? So we're going to take a little bit of time to do that. And then we are also going to talk about what's called the micturition reflex, which is the actual act of urinating, emptying that bladder. All right, so stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.